I was 23 when I first realized I might be drowning in my own thoughts. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. I'd been lying in bed for 3 hours, replaying a conversation from earlier that day, analyzing every word I'd said, every pause, every facial expression the other person made. What did they really mean when they said, "That's interesting"? Did I talk too much? Not enough? Should I have made that joke? The conversation had lasted maybe 10 minutes, but in my mind, I'd been living in it for hours. If this sounds familiar, you're not alone. Today, we're diving deep into the psychology of overthinking, what it really is, why some of us can't seem to turn it off, and what science tells us about the minds that never stop analyzing. Let's start with a fundamental question. What actually is overthinking? On the surface, it seems simple. It's thinking too much. But psychologically, it's far more specific than that. Overthinking typically manifests in two primary forms: rumination and worry. Rumination is thinking repetitively about the past. It's replaying conversations, analyzing past decisions, wondering what you could have done differently. Clinical psychologist Susan Nolan Huxama, who spent decades researching this phenomenon, described rumination as repetitively focusing on the fact that one is distressed, the causes of the distress, and the consequences of the distress, without actually engaging in problem solving. That last part is crucial. Rumination feels productive, but it's not. You're not solving anything. You're just circling the same drain over and over. Worry, on the other hand, is future-oriented. It's the what-if thoughts. What if I fail? What if they don't like me? What if everything goes wrong? Worry takes uncertain future scenarios and treats them as problems to solve. Except you can't solve something that hasn't happened yet. But here's what makes overthinking particularly insidious. It disguises itself as conscientiousness, as thoroughness, as being careful. Our culture often rewards deep thinking, so we tell ourselves we're just being thoughtful. We're just trying to make the right decision. We're just preparing for every possibility. The line between healthy reflection and destructive overthinking isn't always clear, but there is a line. Healthy reflection moves you forward. Overthinking keeps you stuck. So, what's actually happening in the brain of someone who overthinks? Research using fMRI scans has revealed some fascinating patterns. When we overthink, there's heightened activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain responsible for complex thinking, planning, and decision-making. But there's also increased activity in the default mode network, or DMN. The DMN is a network of brain regions that becomes active when we're not focused on the outside world, when we're daydreaming, remembering the past, or imagining the future. It's essentially your brain on autopilot, making sense of yourself and your experiences. In moderate amounts, DMN activity is healthy. It's how we develop self-awareness, learn from experiences, and plan for the future. But in chronic overthinkers, the DMN doesn't know when to quiet down. It stays active even when it should be resting, constantly generating thoughts about the self. There's also a neurochemical component. Studies have found that chronic overthinking is associated with imbalances in neurotransmitters like serotonin and GABA, the same neurotransmitters implicated in anxiety and depression. This isn't coincidental. Overthinking isn't just a symptom of these conditions. It can be both a cause and a consequence, creating a vicious cycle. But perhaps most interesting is what happens to the amygdala, our brain's threat detection system. In habitual overthinkers, the amygdala shows heightened reactivity to uncertain or ambiguous situations. Essentially, when there's no clear answer, the brain treats it as a potential threat and kicks into overdrive, trying to resolve the uncertainty. This explains why overthinkers often struggle most with situations that have no clear right answer. The brain is desperately trying to eliminate uncertainty, but life is inherently uncertain, so the process never ends. Not everyone overthinks to the same degree. So who's most susceptible? Research consistently shows that certain personality traits correlate strongly with overthinking. Neuroticism, the tendency to experience negative emotions more frequently and intensely, is the strongest predictor. People high in neuroticism are more likely to interpret ambiguous situations negatively and to dwell on negative experiences. Perfectionism is another major factor. Perfectionists set impossibly high standards for themselves, which means almost every decision becomes high stakes. When everything needs to be perfect, every choice requires extensive analysis. And even after making a decision, perfectionists continue analyzing whether they made the right choice. Interestingly, high intelligence can also be a risk factor, though not in the way you might think. Intelligence doesn't cause overthinking, but intelligent people often have greater capacity for complex, abstract thinking. This can become a double-edged sword. The same cognitive abilities that allow you to see multiple perspectives and consider various possibilities can also trap you in endless analysis. There's also a strong gender component to overthinking patterns. Multiple studies have found that women report higher levels of rumination than men on average. This isn't because women are inherently more prone to overthinking. It's likely due to a complex mix of socialization, emotional labor expectations, and the way women are taught to process emotions from a young age. But perhaps the most significant vulnerability factor is early life experience. People who grew up in unpredictable environments, where they couldn't reliably predict outcomes, or where they faced criticism for mistakes, often develop overthinking as a coping mechanism. If you learned early that you needed to be constantly vigilant, constantly analyzing situations to stay safe, that pattern doesn't just disappear in adulthood. Let's talk about what overthinking actually costs us, because the price is higher than most people realize. First, there's decision paralysis. When you overthink decisions, you often end up making worse choices, or no choice at all. Research by psychologist Barry Schwartz demonstrated that having too many options, combined with overthinking, leads to decreased satisfaction even when people eventually do choose. The overthinker keeps wondering if another option would have been better. Then there's the relationship toll. Chronic overthinkers often struggle in relationships because they're constantly reading between the lines, looking for hidden meanings, anticipating problems that don't exist yet. A simple "I'm fine" becomes a puzzle to solve. A delayed text message becomes evidence of diminishing interest. This hypervigilance is exhausting, both for the overthinker and for the people around them. Sleep disruption is another major cost. Studies show that rumination is one of the strongest predictors of insomnia. When your mind won't stop analyzing and worrying, sleep becomes elusive. And poor sleep, of course, makes everything worse. It impairs emotional regulation, increases anxiety, and paradoxically makes you even more prone to overthinking the next day. Perhaps most significantly, chronic overthinking is a major risk factor for depression and anxiety disorders. Susan Nolan Hoeksema's longitudinal research found that people who habitually ruminate are 4 times more likely to develop major depression. The relationship is bidirectional. Depression causes rumination, and rumination deepens depression, creating a dangerous feedback loop. But there's a cost that's harder to quantify, the cost of a life half-lived. While you're stuck in your head analyzing every possibility, life is happening around you. Opportunities pass by, moments slip away. You miss the texture of actual lived experience because you're too busy thinking about experience rather than having it. I know this personally. I've missed conversations because I was too busy analyzing them as they happened. I've failed to enjoy trips because I was worrying about whether I was enjoying them correctly. I've lost hours, days, weeks to thoughts that ultimately didn't matter. So how do we break free from overthinking? Let me be clear. If you're a chronic overthinker, you're probably not going to completely eliminate the tendency, but you can manage it. You can reduce its power over you. The first step is recognizing when you're doing it. This sounds obvious, but overthinking often happens automatically. We're deep in a thought spiral before we realize we've started. Developing metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe your own thinking, is crucial. When you notice yourself ruminating or worrying, simply label it. I'm overthinking right now. This simple act of labeling creates distance between you and your thoughts. You're not your thoughts. You're the person observing them. Cognitive behavioral therapy offers several evidence-based techniques. One is setting aside specific worry time, a designated 15 to 20 minute period each day where you allow yourself to overthink freely. Outside that window, when overthinking starts, you postpone it to your worry time. This might sound counterintuitive, but research shows it works. It retrains your brain that overthinking isn't always necessary or urgent. Another powerful technique is the "would I think this way about a friend?" test. Overthinkers tend to be much harsher with themselves than they would be with others. If your friend made the same mistake you're ruminating about, would you really think they were worthless? Would you really believe their life was ruined? Usually not. This perspective shift can interrupt rumination quickly. Physical interventions matter too. Exercise, particularly intense exercise, has been shown to reduce rumination significantly. When you're physically exhausted, your brain simply has less energy for endless analysis. Meditation and mindfulness practices teach the skill of letting thoughts pass without engaging with them, essential for overthinkers who feel compelled to follow every thought to its conclusion. But here's something that doesn't get discussed enough. Sometimes, the answer is simply to act. Overthinking thrives on inaction. When you're stuck in analysis paralysis, sometimes the best thing to do is make an imperfect decision and move forward. Action creates information, real data to work with, rather than the endless hypotheticals that fuel overthinking. I learned this the hard way. After months of overthinking whether to leave a job I was miserable in, analyzing every possible outcome, I finally just quit. And you know what? Some of my worst case scenarios came true. It was financially difficult for a while. I did have moments of doubt, but I also discovered that I could handle it. The actual experience was far less dreadful than the months I'd spent imagining it. Here's what I wish someone had told me when I was lying awake at 2 a.m., trapped in my own thoughts. Your brain is trying to protect you. Overthinking evolved as a survival mechanism, thinking through possibilities, anticipating threats, learning from mistakes kept our ancestors alive. Your brain isn't malfunctioning when it overthinks. It's just trying to keep you safe. But safe isn't the same as alive. Not really. There's a certain irony in overthinking. We do it because we want to make the right choices, avoid mistakes, protect ourselves from pain. But in trying so hard to avoid living wrong, we sometimes forget to live at all. You don't need to have everything figured out. You don't need to analyze every possibility. You don't need to replay every conversation until you've extracted every possible meaning from it. Sometimes the most revolutionary thing an overthinker can do is simply let a thought pass by unexamined, to sit with uncertainty, to make an imperfect choice, and trust that you'll figure out the rest as you go. Because here's the truth. You will make mistakes. You will say the wrong thing sometimes. You will make decisions you later wish you'd made differently. But that's not a failure of thinking. That's not something you could have prevented with more analysis. That's just being human. And maybe that's something worth thinking about. If this resonated with you, I'd love to hear your experience with overthinking in the comments. And if you found this helpful, consider subscribing for more deep dives into psychology and the human mind. Thanks for watching.